Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. Puzzles aplenty today, both home and abroad. Winston Churchill once called Russia a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Certainly, as we speak, no one has much idea what Vladimir Putin actually wants or what he will do with the 130,000 troops poised on the border with Ukraine. For all we know, by the time you watch the repeat of this programme later today, there could be Russian boots on Ukrainian soil. Here at home, political uncertainty reigns. On Thursday morning, the nation's top cop, Cressida Dick, the commissioner of the Met, declared that she planned to stick around and see out her term of office. By nightfall, she'd resigned, she said, because she had lost the confidence of the mayor, Sadiq Khan, who only months before had agreed to reappoint her to the job. Who's next? Your guess is as good as mine. And looming over all this, the biggest riddle of all. Can Boris Johnson survive at number 10? And if he can, for how long? A previous Tory leader, Ian Duncan-Smith, this morning says that if the Prime Minister's fined for lockdown breaches by the police, he's got to go. Number 10 apparently says, not necessarily. Well, let's see if our guest can help us nail some of this jelly to the wall. Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis is here to discuss the pressing issues focusing Boris Johnson's government at the home as well as abroad. The shadow Northern Ireland Secretary Peter Kyle will also be joining me to get Labour's take. Russia expert Mark Galeotti will tell us what he thinks Vladimir Putin's next move over Ukraine could be. It's also been a busy week for the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, culminating in her resignation, as I said. Former Inspector of Constabulary Zoe Billingham will give us her view on the future direction of the Met. And the government has unveiled a new plan to try to tackle growing NHS waiting lists. Health Service boss Chris Hopson will tell us whether he thinks it'll work. But first, I'm joined by the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis. Good morning, Secretary of State.
Good morning.
I know you can't share sensitive intelligence with us, but knowing what you do know, how likely is a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think as the Defence Secretary has said over this weekend, over the last couple of days, actually, we have to be realistic about, with Russia having 100,000 troops now roughly on the border there, that an imminent incursion by Russia is entirely possible. And that's why we've changed the travel advice and the advice we've given to UK citizens who are in Ukraine.
Do you think that the reference to Munich is that helpful in a diplomatically sensitive moment?
Well, I think what Ben has outlined there is given an explanation that people understand, particularly in the context of if people have seen the new movie recently, in the sense of in the run-up to World War II, of course, there was lots of diplomatic work. People thought that was progressing, but of course it turned out not to. And I think what the Defence Secretary quite rightly is doing is drawing the comparison and being clear that there's a lot of diplomatic work going on. Obviously, both he and the Foreign Secretary have been in Russia themselves this week. The Russian state is saying that it is not planning to invade, but when you then have 100,000, now 130,000 we estimate troops on the border, that would indicate that there is the possibility of an incursion. So it's that balance and that decision and that interpretation of the difference between what we hope will be a diplomatic outcome, but the realistic possibility that something much more tragic could occur.
But I suppose one might say it's not that tactful to make the associations with Nazis.
Well, that's not the point, actually, the Defence Secretary was making. Let's be very clear, but what he was drawing was the comparison between the diplomatic attempts in the run-up to World War II and the diplomatic attempts we're all putting in now. We want to see a diplomatic outcome, we want to see a peaceful outcome to this, but we do have to be cognizant of the fact, as you said quite rightly in the outcome, the quote by Winston Churchill is probably as true today as it was back then in the context of diplomatic talks with 130,000 troops sitting right there on the border. And with that kind of accumulation, there is always the possibility and the ability for Russia to move very, very swiftly and very quickly should it decide to do so, which obviously we hope they won't.
Well, there is a school of thought, of course, that says that actually he's not really going to do this. But what he has done, bear in mind that Russia is at best a middle-ranking economic power. It's got a lot of armed forces, but not as much as some. But he has achieved a pretty spectacular strategic victory already by exposing some deep fault lines in the West and essentially having everybody dancing to his tune.
Actually, I think what he has done is bring the West, NATO and the European alliance together to show that we're not prepared, and nobody should be prepared to see a country, a democratically run country, have its borders threatened in that way, and to be very clear that the world is not going to put up with that. And we need to see a diplomatic outcome to this and a peaceful outcome. But putting threats like that on an independent country is just inappropriate.
But he knows that, in truth, we've said that we would not put soldiers into Ukraine, that we would support them in whatever way we can. But essentially, this is another example of the West's failure to stand up to Russian aggression. We can go back as far as Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, or, frankly, don't have to go back that far, Crimea 2014. He's done it before.
Well, it may well be that President Putin is testing the boundaries where he can go. And I think that's why it's been important that the West, and I have to say, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, the UK as a whole have been leading the way in bringing that alliance together to be very clear to Russia that this is not something we will tolerate. We do want to see a peaceful outcome to this, but NATO is very, very clear that it is right that a democratic, independent country like the Ukraine is allowed to continue as an independent, democratic country without this kind of bullying or threats from a state like Russia.
Well, it may be a great alliance, but some people will say that's just an alliance of impotence.
Well, actually, no. I think at the moment, what we're seeing Russia has said over the last few days in the meeting they had with Ben Wallace, that they are not looking to invade. If we can avoid that and we have a diplomatic outcome, then it will have been successful. But I think it's also right that the West working together is very clear that should Russia take a different course of action, that there will be repercussions for that, because it cannot be acceptable that an independent state, a democratic state, has that kind of threat put upon it, let alone that kind of incursion should it happen.
Well, let's talk about the possibility of deterring him if he's pausing. You said that the West is united, but it's not entirely right, is it? For example, we know that the EU's banks have an exposure to Russia of over $60 billion. That's 4 times the exposure of American banks. So the Americans can afford to make threats, but the EU may be more cautious. And surely that is actually what Mr. Wallace is talking about, that our EU partners may be a bit less willing than the United States to take the tough deterrent steps against Mr. Putin and his allies by cutting off their supplies to money and so on.
Well, obviously, we're not in that position yet, so we'll see what the outcome is. Well, no, I mean,
that's
in terms
interesting.
of
why aren't we in that position already?
No,
why aren't we taking steps already
Trevor,
to squeeze on him?
Well, no, Trevor, we've been very clear. We will bring in more sanctions. That's one of the repercussions there will be.
Yeah, but my question is, why are we waiting?
We already have some sanctions against Russia already. We've already taken the power in the last week or so with the statutory instrument in Parliament to allow the UK government to put more sanctions in place. But I spent most of last week in the United States, predominantly on Northern Ireland business for the UK government. But what is very clear, the United States are absolutely unified in this approach to ensure that we do not see an incursion, and should Russia take that kind of activity, that there will be repercussions. And that's one of the things we've been very clear with Russia about. And to be fair, so have our partners across Europe as well.
Well, our own Parliament hasn't been very convinced of our fortitude in this. The Intelligence Security Committee, 18 months or more ago, said Russian influence in the UK is the new normal. Successive governments have welcomed the oligarchs and their money with open arms, providing them with a means of recycling illicit finance through the London laundromat and connections at the highest levels with access to UK companies and political figures. Now, look, we've been saying for years now we're going to clamp down. Actually, Russian billionaires are still whacking their money through London's banks. We haven't actually done anything to hurt Putin.
Well, I disagree with that. I have to say, look, before I was in this role, I was the security minister. And one of the things I know, without going into there's kind of areas that I can't really talk about in terms of security intelligence, we as a country, not only do we already have sanctions against Russia in place, actually as a country, I think we're in a position where we've done phenomenal work over the years so that we're not that kind of venue. We are an attractive place for the world's money and the world's businesses to invest and to trade. That's a good thing for the City of London. But we do have things in place, whether it's unexplained wealth orders and a whole range of other measures that mean that we are somewhere that deters the kind of illegal activity that you refer to. And I have to say, if you look at some of the famous names around the world that people talk about in terms of that kind of Russian activity, this is not a country that they spend time in, it's not a country they come to. And I do think we have those measures in place to protect our institutions.
Well, they don't have to come here. They can, they can stay in Monaco or whatever it is, but their money is here. And I'm curious about this because Liz Truss, when she was sitting where you are sitting a week or two ago, said to me that you're going to introduce new legislation that will give you greater powers to confiscate the assets of these people and put pressure on Putin. If actually we've been so successful so far, why do you need new legislation?
Well, because, look, that's actually quite simple, Trevor. Yes, we have. We have things like, as I say, unexplained wealth orders is one of the tools in our armoury that we can use, and the security services, the police services do use that. It's been very successful. It's actually one of the things that Ben Wallace brought in when he was security minister. But we're always looking at how we reassess. As financial markets move, as technology moves, you've always got to keep these things under review to make sure that you are able to have the tools that you need to deal with what people are trying to do. It's the same with fraud and internet activity more generally. These things are always moving, they're always developing, and it's right that our teams keep that under review. And that's partly why, even just last week, we've taken the power to bring in more sanctions should we need to do so. That's something that the teams are looking at the moment to make sure that if we need to do that, we have the ability to do it and do it in a way that actually has impact.
All right, let's talk about your own response with Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is right now without a First Minister or a Deputy First Minister. I understand you're just back from Washington, where I gather that you've been talking about this to officials there. What were you hoping to achieve in your trip to America?
Well, it was a long-planned trip, actually. It was around a range of issues, just generally about and I was in both Washington and Boston, about the investment that the US has generally had in Northern Ireland, business investment, which is hugely important as part of delivering prosperity, and that's part of the peace process, is seeing jobs and opportunities created, and particularly with the burgeoning cyber and technology sector in Northern Ireland, there's huge US interest in that. So looking at how we bolster that, how we do more on that, how we develop that, but also talking to our friends and colleagues in the United States to make sure that they are aware of our position on the Northern Ireland Protocol. The US have a huge interest in what happens in Northern Ireland, their emotional attachment, their involvement in the Good Friday Agreement. They've been a key player in Northern Ireland over the years, and make sure that they understand what are the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol and what is it we envisage as a way through this.
Well, indeed, you talked about the emotional attachment of the Americans, and the President Biden, himself of Irish heritage, was clear in his election campaign that there would be no trade deals until the protocol issue is sorted out. Were you able to get them to budge on that?
Well, actually, the Secretary of State for International Trade, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, is going to the US just in the next few weeks to continue the discussions about trade deals. One of the things I do find, the US see us as a hugely important, obviously one of their strongest allies in the world. They're keen to trade with us, to look at what more we can do around global trade and trade between the UK and the US. That's very positive. But also making sure that we're able to explain what are the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. What is it we want to see in terms of finding a way through this? We want to get an agreement with the EU, but that does require the EU to show some pragmatism and some flexibility for the benefit of the people of Northern Ireland.
But Biden has more or less said he would veto any deal until there is agreement on the protocol, which presumably would involve agreement by the nationalists as well as the unionists.
Well, a couple of things on that, Trevor. So first of all, to be fair to the President, that's not exactly what he has said. What the US
what
say...
He meant.
Well, no, I'm not sure I'd entirely agree with that. What he has said and what the US have consistently said is they want to see an outcome agreed between the parties and that respects the Good Friday Agreement. That's exactly where the UK government is. You're quite right. This is an important factor. This is something that's got to work for the whole community of Northern Ireland, both the nationalist community and the unionist community. That's what we want to achieve. And let's also be very clear, what often gets missed in this discussion is the problems with the protocol affect all of the community in Northern Ireland. Michelle O'Neill, who was Deputy First Minister, the lead Sinn Féin representative in Northern Ireland, herself has said there are problems with the protocol we want to get resolved. So this is not just an issue for unionism. If you can't get access to the products you need to get access to as a consumer or as a business in Northern Ireland, which is currently the case, that affects everybody. And that's why we're seeing one of the examples of this is the problems the Jewish community are having. So this is not just something about unionism. This is something we need to resolve for everybody in Northern Ireland.
By the way, you've wrote an article on Friday which basically said, challenge the unionists to accept that if elections in May result in a situation where the First Minister is from Sinn Féin, that they would accept the post of Deputy First Minister. What are you going to do if they say no? Because they haven't given you any reassurances, have they?
Well, none of them are giving assurances about anything in the head of the elections. I think the very quote that politicians in Northern Ireland have given is they're not commenting on what the outcome of an election may be before an election. As a politician, I understand that. But look, I'll be very clear about this. As I was last summer when Sinn Féin were trying to bring down the executive, I don't think the people of Northern Ireland want to tolerate or are happy with anybody threatening the institutions of Stormont. That is part of the Good Friday Agreement. It's how we ensure we have good government in Northern Ireland, that devolved authority to deliver on the issues like health and education that need so much reform and work in Northern Ireland. We'll support the executive to do that. We want to see a functioning executive, all the parties working together to do that.
All right. Now, on Friday evening, Prime Minister received a questionnaire from the Metropolitan Police on his alleged involvement in many parties that took place in Downing Street. Now, you just talked about the important issues that face people in Northern Ireland, face people all over this country, and most people would say that every second of the Prime Minister's attention should be on those big issues: energy, the Ukraine, the crisis in the health service, the economy. But it won't be while he's answering questionnaires. How much longer are you going to let this go on?
Well, obviously, the investigation into this is a matter for the police. I'm not going to put timeframes on them. They've got to be able to do their job independently, autonomously, and see that through. We've all been very clear about that. But I have to say, in the dealings I've had with the Prime Minister, he is absolutely focused on the job in hand, about what he's doing for the British people, whether it's on the conversations I've had with him on Northern Ireland, be it the protocol or the situation with the executive. And I know from cabinet meetings, I was attending most of the cabinet meeting last week before I flew to the US, his work and his focus on our health service and, as you say, on the issues with Russia and the Ukraine.
Yeah, but as far as I know, the Prime Minister's human, and it would be ridiculous to imagine that he's not thinking about that. As Ian Duncan Smith says in one of the papers this morning, I'm paraphrasing here, that if he is fined by the police, he is toast and he has to go. Well,
I haven't seen Ian's comments this morning, but I have to say what I have seen is a Prime Minister who is absolutely focused and dedicated to working on the issues that are affecting people across the United Kingdom, whether it's the cost of living, whether it's the issues, as I say, with Russia, and obviously in my portfolio, the issues with Northern Ireland. He is somebody who is absolutely focused on that. He works day and night to make sure we are delivering a country that becomes even better for people.
So he's paying no attention to the fact that a former Prime Minister, John Major, says he had shredded the UK's reputation. Another former Prime Minister, Theresa May, said the public had a right to expect their Prime Minister to have read the rules, understand the meaning of the rules and set an example by following the rules. Are all those people wrong, and is he not even bothered about that?
No, he will actually be very, very focused on the issues that matter to all of us. And look, we are talking about a Prime Minister as Foreign Secretary worked to bring the world together when we had the Skripal situation, we've got a Prime Minister who is now bringing the world together in terms of how we deal with Russia and Ukraine. He's working within this country about dealing with this COVID after problem that we've got, the crisis we're seeing in the health service, dealing with the backlog of that, dealing with the issues that people care about, our energy costs. They're what he's focused on, and that's absolutely right where he should be focused on, because that's what makes our country better.
Well, look, let me give one last go at this. And this is really a question to you and your colleagues rather than the Prime Minister. You came into politics to support the Conservative cause, national sovereignty, lower taxes, all freedom of the individual, all of that. Every Sunday, you and your colleagues have to come out and to try to explain what the Prime Minister's socialising means. Is there any point for you at which the great cause of Disraeli and Churchill and Thatcher becomes more important than loyalty to this Prime Minister?
Well, I always enjoy coming to talk to you on a Sunday, Trevor, and your colleagues across the media. So I would always be happy to come out and,
we're fun
and do
people,
that.
We're fun people, I know. But honestly, there must be a point at which you have to say, can't do this. This is killing the cause I came into politics for.
Trevor, as I said in a conversation I had with somebody at the end of last week, look, I feel very, very fortunate to be honoured enough to be in a position to serve in the cabinet. I've served as a government minister under 3 prime ministers. When you're asked by prime ministers to serve your country, I think it's an honour to be able to do that. My focus is and always has been on what we're doing for the people of our country, what I do for the people of my constituency, and in this role, obviously, the people of Northern Ireland. I think it's right that we're focused on that, and I have to say, as I said to you a few moments ago, my experience is that's what the Prime Minister's focused on, and that's why he has my absolute 100% plus loyalty. Look, I think this is a Prime Minister who's doing the right things for our country. He's got the big decisions right. I think he'll fight and he will win as a result of that the next general election.
All right, well, let's deal with a couple of the real-world problems you're facing. I mean, this week, the resignation of Cressida Dick, Commission of the Met, appears to have taken the government by surprise. And for you, it must be somewhat alarming because she's one of the key people in the fight against terrorism, which is a big priority for you. MI5 says that the national threat level from terrorism is substantial and Northern Ireland-related threat level is severe. For your point of view, how quickly does a new commissioner have to be in place? Well,
look, first, just as a matter of fact, I think it's just important to make the point, obviously, the policing of terrorism in Northern Ireland is dealt separately. That's a matter for the PSNI working with partners in Northern Ireland rather than the Metropolitan Police. But all of the police forces work together. And obviously, as an ex-security minister, the importance of the Met's role, their national role in counter-terrorism is hugely important. And the teams who do that work, that I've always said I think are the best in the world. They're absolutely phenomenal. It is obviously important that we give them the stability of having their leadership dealt with as quickly as possible. I know that's something that the Home Secretary will be focused on doing, but it's right that we give the space for the Home Secretary and obviously consulting with the Mayor and others to make sure we get the right person for that job. But the Home Secretary will be dealing with that very soon.
It's being reported by some newspapers that the Home Secretary would like to essentially cut the Mayor out of that decision-making. Can you confirm or tell us whether that is true or not?
Well, as far as I'm aware, that's just rumours. I think it's always best to avoid getting involved with rumours. I think the Commissioner ultimately is working with and for the Mayor. That's obviously what's led to the decision. The rather odd decision in some ways, because as you rightly say, the Mayor just a few months ago extended Cressida Dick's tenure as the Commissioner for London. But look, the focus will be on getting the right person to succeed Cressida Dick, to take the Metropolitan Police forward, to put in the reforms that we all need to see and deal with some of the issues that the Met has faced recently, and to continue ensuring that the Met can grow to be and do the work it does, particularly in some of those sensitive national areas, as one of the best, if not arguably the best in the world.
In the end, does the government think that the Mayor's decision was a good one? Was he right? Was he right to withdraw his confidence?
Well, I say I don't know the details of why Sadiq Khan, having just very recently extended Cressida Dick's tenure, suddenly decided to withdraw his confidence in her. I absolutely respect Cressida's decision based on the conversation we had with him. That's a decision she's had to make. I think the focus has to now be on the fact that we want to see the Met moving forward. There is work to do. It's a big organisation, the largest police force in the United Kingdom, and to get the leadership in there, that means it can go forward and continue to develop and change as it needs to deal with the issues it's had, but also to deal with the issues of policing on both the national and the London scale that the Met has to deal with in the years ahead.
Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Pleasure.
Right, well, let's get Labour's take on this with the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Kyle. Good morning, Mr. Kyle. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, has just been giving me his take on the political impasse in Northern Ireland. Are you satisfied with what he told me and the way he's handling it?
Well, no, there's been a really tough lead up to the challenges in Northern Ireland. There was 2 years ago, there was a deal that was negotiated by Brandon's predecessor, which put forward a raft of different measures which needed legislation in Westminster. None of it has been legislated for. So some of the key things are cultural packages, which would have introduced languages, measures to deal with the legacy issues of the violence in Northern Ireland. All of these have been bungled and mismanaged in the years since that, and none of it's been introduced. So that's destabilised the system, the politics of Northern Ireland. And then put into the middle of that, of course, is a Prime Minister that goes to Northern Ireland, makes an absolute solemn promise there'll be no border down the Irish Sea, and there has no intention of honouring that promise, and in fact breaks it straight away. And this has put a division right down, a schism right down Northern Ireland at a time when politics is already fragile. So the Good Friday Agreement is under huge pressure at the moment because we have a government that doesn't represent all of Northern Ireland. It only represents part of the politics of Northern Ireland. We have a Northern Ireland Secretary who doesn't really engage right across all of the communities in Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, when the Stormont collapsed, Brandon Lewis gets on a plane to Washington. He doesn't get on a plane to Belfast, where he's needed to bring people together and start to hammer out a deal that will get Stormont up and running again. So I am afraid that this is a government who has played fast and loose with the Good Friday Agreement and all of the measures which has delivered peace, stability and economic growth in Northern Ireland. And that's a real worry.
So to be clear, you are saying that the decision by the unionists to withdraw their leader from the First Minister's post, and the essential paralysis of that government is really Boris Johnson and Brandon Lewis's fault. It's not really anything to do with the Northern Ireland parties.
All political leaders, all politicians must accept responsibility for their own actions. And I'm saying that the DUP themselves have been very explicit about that. They're not, always blaming others. But there is a key thing here. If you look at what the DUP have said, and you look at what the leader, Jeffrey Donaldson, has said, it is very, very clear when you look at the world through their eyes, they have had a set of bargains with the Tory party and with Boris Johnson. And every one of the promises they've been made by Boris Johnson has been broken. They have been lied to repeatedly by Boris Johnson. And then we find out just last week when Jeffrey Donaldson said the Prime Minister has told him that the protocol negotiations that are currently underway only have a 30% possibility of success. This is what the Prime Minister is saying privately.
Mr. Kyle,
there is no plan B.
I just want to get clear, though,
by government as to what that would lead to. This is the kind of thing that is going on behind the scenes, and it is no wonder that is destabilising Northern Ireland.
OK, I just want to get clear that basically you're attributing really the problems here to the government in Westminster and not really anything to do with Stormont. If Labour were in power, what would you do to resolve this? Let's not go back at what you might not have done and all of that, but what would you be doing tomorrow to resolve this?
Well, not tomorrow. I'd be there today. I wouldn't have gone to the US.
Whenever.
I would have cancelled that US trip, and I would have been there from the very moment that things became unstable.
You're going back and telling me what you would not have done. Just tell me what you would have done. What would you do now?
That's what I'm saying. I would be there and I wouldn't have left. If I was Secretary of State, I wouldn't have left.
What would you do now?
Get people around the table, figure out some of the challenges and make things, get things onto the record. There have been promises made about the protocol, for example. I think the government have played fast and loose with its words about the protocol. It's clear they don't think the negotiations are going to succeed. They have no plan B in place. And if they do trigger Article 16, it will have implications right the way across the whole of the UK economy, not just impact in limited ways as it is currently the Northern Ireland economy. But all Kyle, of these things, there's been double speak from the government. There will be no double speak from the Labour Party, and we will return to the principle of the Labour Party being the honest broker that Northern Ireland needs.
But Mr. Kyle, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson spoke to us last week, and the problem was that he said some things about the government. He said the government could pay more attention. But essentially, his objection was to the way that the protocol operates. What would you do differently about the protocol than what...
with the protocol, we have been very clear.
Not how would you get people around the table, but what would you actually do? What would you put to the EU to solve the problem of the objection to the way it operates right now?
So the protocol has to evolve. The Labour Party has said that. But the way to make the protocol evolve is actually to have functional relationships with the EU. At the moment, they are dysfunctional. Liz Truss is still making the mistake that David Frost made by negotiating via op-ed in the Telegraph with the EU. They are not coming to any clear arrangements. We need a deal on veterinary services. That should be negotiable because actually both sides have a very clear landing zone for that. And we need to move on into the future to some more consumer products. I think we all know where this is going. The problem is that it's not acceptable to a small faction in the Tory party that have Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, to ransom right now, including Liz Truss, who's playing to them because of her own leadership ambitions. The Labour Party will incrementally and in a solid way move forward, adding on to the deal, improving the deal, and showing that each aspect of the new deal will work over time to build the trust with the EU. At the moment, the government is not acting in good faith, and it hasn't acted in good faith. It has delivered a deal that it's trying to distance itself from. This is the deal Boris Johnson negotiated. It is his deal. He didn't even read it before signing it.
Thank you. OK, could we move on to an area where the government is not responsible, where we can talk about where Labour is actually in charge and talk about what Labour does? And I want to talk about policing. You used to be Shadow Justice Minister. Was the Mayor of London right to withdraw his confidence from the Met Police Commissioner?
Well, there's a lot of discussion around our country at the moment about people at the top of organisations accepting responsibility and what that actually means. So, yes, unfortunately, it got to the point where Cressida Dick had to accept responsibility for all of the ongoing revelations and inaction with reform in the police. And Sadiq Khan clearly got to the point where he decided that she needed to leave. And actually, that was what accepting responsibility for the person at the top meant. I just wish that Boris Johnson would do the same in the way that he has mismanaged our country and broken the rules. I'm not saying Cressida Dick has broken the rules, but she has failed to implement the changes that have been needed over time.
It would be great. We do spend quite a lot of time saying the words Boris Johnson in this programme. It would be great if we talked about somebody else. But sticking with the issue of the Met, the mayor supported her reappointment just a few months ago. What changed?
Well, there's just more.
Because most of the events that he's quoted happened before that.
Down over time. So if you look at the revelations that came out of the Charing Cross police station, the independent report revealed extreme misogyny and other issues there. Not just sexism, not the sort of thing that people can put down to a way of interpreting the behaviour there. There was extreme misogyny. Now that's a new revelation on top of all of the different revelations which have come out from Sarah Everard and beyond. The public need change. They need to know that change actually is taking place. So I'm afraid that this has been ongoing. This has been ongoing for too long. And the public are just starting to wonder. Now, there was a poll that's just come out recently where now only 43% of the public believe that the police are able to tackle crime in the right way. This is the first time we've had these kind of low figures before. People are losing confidence, not just in the police, but the people who are managing the police in the Home Office and the Home Secretary herself. So something has to change. And unfortunately, that has to start at the top. And we need a new approach. It is really sad because I know firsthand just how dedicated the vast majority of police are and the incredible job that police do. There are a lot of women police officers who feel very strongly about the issues that are going on themselves. This isn't just, people outside the police force complaining about the people inside the police force. There are people inside the police who are desperate for change and reform that the public need and the police need. Those people need to be empowered. Yvette Cooper today is releasing a 5-point plan to do so, which starts with putting women and violence against women and girls as a priority for the Home Office, which needs to be a priority for the police force in terms of reform going forward, but also looking at all of the other measures which need to be proactively changed in the police force, including whistleblowing, including use of social media.
Forgive me, can I interrupt you just for Sorry to interrupt you, but before we have that much time left, before we move on, I would like to give you the chance to say something about the situation in Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer made a well-publicised visit to NATO headquarters this week, obviously, I think, to reinforce the view that Labour supports NATO. Now, Brandon Lewis has just been telling me that the government will be introducing fresh legislation that will allow the government to confiscate the assets of Putin's friends. But as I said to him, the government's talked tough on this before. Do you think this time that there will be an effective regime put in place? And what would that look like for Labour?
I have absolutely no confidence that the government are equipped to deal with this, simply because when you look at all of the taxation reforms that they have made to date, they're doing so not in the interests of the British economy, they're doing it in the interests of the people who donate money to the Tory party, and that includes a lot of Russian people. We're not going to get the kind of reforms that we need. What we need to do is have a new set of transparency laws. We need to know, for example, who is owning property, particularly in London, and very expensive property, because at the moment there are all sorts of very easy ways that oligarchs and people with lots of Russian money who are laundering money via the property market are doing so and are able to hide it. We need to reform the law so that property is transparent. Secondly, Companies House. There are a lot of people who are setting up very dodgy companies in this country, and Companies House enables Russians to hide who are the ultimate owners of these companies, who are investing money in our country, who are seeping money into our economy. We need transparency from that as well. So that needs reform at Companies House. And then on top of that, we need to make sure
Mr. Lammy
that
told me that last week about transparency and got that point. But just as a last question, really, once you know, and Labour has already named some of the people that you're referring to, what would you do about them? Would you confiscate their properties? Would you freeze their bank accounts? What would you do?
Well, we already have, because Labour passed the unexplained wealth orders. Labour Party, brought this legislation in, but this government doesn't use them. So we do already have the powers. If people don't have explained wealth, or we believe that the origins of wealth are coming from criminal activity, or they don't belong in our country. The powers are there, they're just not used. So if the law needs updating, then of course the Labour Party supports that. Margaret Hodge has had a almost lifelong career in politics, trying to clear up the dodgy money that's coming into our economy. The Magnitsky Acts came via
sanctions, yes.
Margaret Hodge, and the Labour Party sort of has implemented and supported those acts. We need to find the source of this money, and then we need to act upon it.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kyle, for your time this morning. Well, let's get some more now on the escalating crisis in Ukraine. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, says the floundering diplomacy has a whiff of Munich about it. So have efforts to appease Vladimir Putin failed, and is war now inevitable? Mark Galliotti is a Russia expert and Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and he joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Galliotti. Thank you so much for joining us. What do you think is going through Mr. Putin's mind this morning?
Well, that's obviously the key question that we're all trying to work out. And I think what we have to appreciate is the extent to which Putin is not the kind of person who fixes himself in a particular track and timetable and rigorously sticks to that. He clearly believes in creating options for himself and then constantly reassessing them. So, I mean, what he will be doing today is, we're told that there is this war plan that would actually be triggered on Wednesday. Maybe, maybe not. But on the other hand, he'll be looking at, well, what are the likely costs of actions? What are the likely benefits? So this is it. I mean, I think he will constantly be reassessing that. And I think that is why it's so important that we keep up both the pressure, but also make it clear that there are off-ramps. Because unfortunately, if we give him an option which is essentially between escalation and capitulation, then he will probably escalate.
What does an off-ramp look like in this context? That's a very interesting concept.
Well, what we have to realize is that, first of all, Russia believes that it has some genuine security concerns. Now, we may disagree with a lot of the basic precepts about whether NATO is aggressive and so forth, but just simply telling the Russians that they're wrong is not going to get them to say, oh, my apologies, and we'll back away. So they have to have an opportunity to basically talk through their various issues. Secondly, there are a lot of specific issues, many of which, frankly, the Americans have already brought onto the table, that in some ways what we have to do is talk them up as concessions to the Russians. It may well, and it does, stick in the craw to, in effect, act as President Putin's PR agents. But in some ways, we must get away from a situation in which almost we're trying to push him into a position where he will feel that he's been defeated. And instead, we want him to feel that what we're offering, which does not in any way infringe on Ukrainian sovereignty and the wider European security architecture, but that what is already there actually is a genuine step forward for him. So a lot of this is frankly smoke and mirrors, which is, after all, what diplomacy is often all about.
Well, it's very interesting insight into Mr. Putin's psychology. I talked to Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian billionaire and former friend, I suppose, or associate of Mr. Putin, and he said that he was a little bit paranoid. And Putin once said, I haven't got the quote in front of me, but I think Putin once said that the Russian bear could be quiet, but on the other hand, if it stayed quiet, then its enemies would be tearing its claws and fangs out, and that therefore, I suppose, in a way, they had to be aggressive. What do you think about that assessment, that Putin basically is not just smart, but also paranoid?
I think there is a lot of paranoia in not just Putin, but a lot of the people around him. Remember, these are people in their late 60s and early 70s, a lot of them veterans of the KGB. All of them, though, products of the old Soviet system. So they still have a lot of the old attitudes, and they're also the ones who are probably most caught by the traumatic end of empire, which has metastasized from a what have we lost to a and who took it from us. So yes, there is a very toxic perspective on the West there. But to go back to the point about the Russian bear, is look, unfortunately, the Russians have internalized, rightfully, a sense that the West only pays attention to Russia when Russia causes problems for the West. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. And unfortunately, that means, obviously, without in any way excusing what Putin is doing, we shouldn't be surprised that the Russians continue to make problems for us, because that's how they get our attention. But I think that is the key thing. If all he wanted to do was crack the whip on Ukraine, he could have done it by now. He could have done it much more quickly and with much less of this kind of lengthy, almost theatrical buildup. The fact that we have this is a sign that at least Putin is hoping that he can get something through negotiation rather than having to unleash the troops with all the massive political, economic, and social costs that would involve.
So that really leads us to the key question. How likely do you think an invasion is? It sounds as though you think not very likely.
I mean, that is the question. And unfortunately, then no doubt I will be proven wrong, whatever I predict. And I think this is the thing. At the moment, it's only Putin who gets to decide, and we don't know what he's thinking for certain. My view is that invasion or some substantial military escalation is not his plan A. He's absolutely hoping to use all these other methods, intimidation, diplomacy, covert attacks, and so forth, to get enough of concessions that he feels he's actually managed to make his point and put Russia at the center of the world again, which is where he thinks it should be. That doesn't mean, though, that military escalation is not there as a plan B or a plan C as an option. If he really feels that he's not going to get anything anywhere, then anyway, he will probably feel he has little option but to escalate to a degree. Maybe not these kind of apocalyptic scenarios we've been hearing about, rolling the tanks around Kyiv and so forth, but some kind of military escalation just to make a point. But as I said, I think that that's still plan B. If I was going to guess, do I think there's going to be a war on Wednesday? I will say not.
Sorry. Last question, I guess. In this rather delicate balance of decision-making, how helpful is the Defence Secretary's reference to Munich and essentially appeasement?
I mean, I think that's unfortunate, not least because it obviously casts the Russians as Nazi Germany, which, you know, for a country which lost so much in the Second World War, which still calls it the Great Patriotic War, that's a very neuralgic point. But I mean, I think in fairness, the Russians are sophisticated enough to realize that there is the dialogue that you have with your own domestic audience and the dialogue you have with other countries. And in fact, Ben Wallace's visit to Moscow seems to have actually been pretty successful. It was very sober. It wasn't a highly publicized spat. It was actually sort of two people trying to talk about challenges, and also the parallel and very important talks between Chief of the Defense Staff, Admiral Radakin, and his Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov. So, I mean, actually, in those senses, I think Ben Wallace has probably accumulated enough credit that he can be allowed a few rhetorical flourishes as far as Moscow is concerned.
Mark Gagliotti, thank you very much indeed. Now, on the great debate tomorrow night, we'll be asking, do we have the leaders we deserve? Has politics become a spectator sport where personality is valued over morals and character? And are celebrities and athletes now the role models for the next generation? You can email the Great Debate at sky.uk if you want to get involved, and tune in anyway at 9 p.m. tomorrow. That'll be more of me, I'm afraid, but there you go. While many have criticised Cressida Dick's record during 5 years in charge of the Metropolitan Police, scandals surrounding the Met are nothing new. To be honest, I was reporting on them as a young reporter in the 1980s. An independent review of the culture and standards of behaviour, led by Baroness Casey, is about to get underway. The chances are that she'll give Met bosses some pretty grim reading. Zoe Billingham served as the Inspector of Constabulary until last year, and she joins me now. Good morning.
Morning.
Cressida Dick, most senior police officer in the police service. She resigned on Thursday. Given her track record, was that the right thing for her to do?
I was really quite surprised by the resignation, Trevor. And my view on Cressida is she's led the Metropolitan Police with care, compassion, and candour. She's really generated great loyalty amongst the frontline troops. And in effect, she's been overtaken by a series of what I can only describe as catastrophic events. She was walking, wasn't she, an incredibly tough tightrope. So post the appalling killing of Sarah Everard and the erosion of public trust, she really needed to focus on rebuilding that trust, while at the same time kind of maintaining the confidence of her own staff. You know, the vast majority of the men and women working across the Met are getting up every day to do a great job for members of the public. But I think the scale of the events, so from Sarah Everard through to the photographs of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, which was just a disgrace, I think the last straw was really the Charing Cross incident. I can only describe it as an abomination. The comments that we heard there, I've never heard the likes in any walk of life, let alone policing. And although Cressida had a plan, and I've looked at the plan, and I think it was a pretty good plan, the trouble was it wasn't moving at pace. And that's what led to the situation we found earlier on in the week, with her finding she had no option but to resign.
So do you think that the mayor, in the end, was right to say he no longer had confidence in her?
That's got to be a decision for him, and I know that's a kind of a get out of jail free kind of comment. But the issue that I think that he saw was that the reform wasn't happening at pace. The trouble, I think, that the mayor and now the Home Secretary, who leads on the appointment of the Met Commissioner, the problem that they now have is whoever the incoming commissioner is, they will have a very, very full inbox, and they will have precisely the same problems that Cressida was contending with to deal with. And the problem here, Trevor, is at the root of this is there is a real cultural issue in the Met that needs to be unpacked, unpicked, and dealt with. And we know that that's not going to happen overnight, but that needs to be at the top of the new commissioner's inbox. I think Cressida was a very talented leader. There are obviously many other talented police officers up and down the country. Will they do a better job than Cressida? Well, that remains to be seen, but she was really at the forefront of police leadership.
One of the things that has been said about this series of events is that the mayor spoke in his statement this week about the culture of misogyny, racism and homophobia. Some reports say it reminded him of the bad old days with the police when he was growing up. Is that what a commissioner should really mostly be judged on, rather than whether they are catching bad people, stopping burglaries, stopping knife crime on the streets?
It's it's a great question as ever. The issue with public trust is not that it's a nice thing to have. It's essential, because in this country we police by consent, and when that trust erodes, the whole legitimacy of policing erodes as well. Whether that's in terms of people reporting to the police, whether that's in terms of people from communities that aren't properly represented within policing coming forward and joining the police. It is so much at the heart of all that the police do that it is right to focus on trust. But, the other part of your question is, should the Met Commissioner be focusing on the day job too? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a series of reports over the last week or so about the extent to which the police are actually serving the public well across the country. I find it pretty dismal that only 5% of burglars are brought to justice, 1% of rapes end in conviction. I lead on violence against women and girls, or did in my former role, and I was astonished that 3/4 of domestic abuse-related crime reported to the police was being closed down early before the offender is brought to justice on the grounds of evidential difficulties. There's 1.6 million crimes of domestic abuse a year. Trevor, you do the math. How many of our victims are being left in that position where they've reported to the police, but actually they've not seen an outcome which they think is just and fair. So quite right in terms of your question. We've got to look at both sides of this. Do the day job well. Police use their powers well. Keep the Londoners safe, but also absolutely rebuilding trust is central to all of this.
Well, you've spoken eloquently about the day job, and the data, you've just given some of it, suggests that actually things are getting even worse, and that, as you've quoted the figures on rape, which seem extraordinarily low, on knife crime, the proportion of offenders given immediate custodial sentences decreased to 31%, but from 2020 to 2021. What is going wrong?
I think there's a whole range of factors. The police are really busy. There is no denying that. And certainly when I was Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, we saw a massive increase in crime going onto the books, not necessarily because there was more crime, but the police were getting a whole lot better at reporting it. I think in some forces, there's been a tendency with all of this busyness to look for easy routes to close crimes down rather than to have to investigate them rapidly. And I'm always quite depressed when I hear about crimes going into what's called a crime resolution desk, which is where someone has a quick look at the crime, works out if there's any leads to follow, was there any CCTV, was there any witnesses, and makes a really rapid decision then not to investigate further. The police are there to do very basic things in policing: turn up quick, listen to the victim and take what they say at face value and believe them, and do a proper investigation. You know, do house-to-house inquiries, look for CCTV, not push it all back onto the victim to do all that themselves. And if the police aren't turning up rapidly, you know, that golden hour, it's a bit of an old cliche, but that golden hour of actually being able to gather that evidence, to build a case, to bring the offender to justice, you know, to some extent, again, a cliche, but back to some of the basics in policing across England and Wales, I think.
You, let's finally, if I may just come back to this point of trust that you spoke about. Part of it is getting the day job done, but part of it, presumably, is also behaving properly. Half of the police employees who committed gross misconduct in the last 3 years were not dismissed. Of 118 cases where a standards breach was proven by disciplinary panels, only 55 led to the sack, according to an analysis of figures by the Independent Office for Police Conduct. And this is not just the Met, this is across the board. This is just not good enough, is it?
No, it's not. The public won't understand it. I don't understand it. It makes no sense. You know, I think the whole complexity of police regulations around discipline and misconduct needs a complete overhaul. I hope the various reviews that are ongoing will completely look at this, because if people transgress in this position of power and trust, and this is what this is in policing, then they do need to be brought to book. And I don't think the public, I don't know the details behind Charing Cross, but I think it's hard for the public to fathom that two of those officers, who were at the very least bystanders in that abomination of that discussion on WhatsApp, have now been promoted. What sort of message is that sending out across the organisation? So yeah, we definitely need to have a look at misconduct. We also, Trevor, need to look at the type of person that we want to see within policing. What are their traits? What's their ambitions? Why are they joining policing in the first place? And when they have joined, what are the police doing to make sure, if there are rotten apples, that the counter-corruption measures in place are sufficient to be able to root them out?
Zoe Billingham, thank you very much. I hope we'll speak again about this.
Thank you.
Earlier this week, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, told MPs that the NHS waiting list in England will keep growing for another 2 years. Well, it already stands at least 6 million. But the government says its long-awaited elective recovery plan, which aims to ensure no one has to wait longer than 2 years for planned hospital treatment by this summer, will help to reduce the backlog. But will an overstretched health service be able to deliver? Chris Hopson is Chief Executive of NHS Providers. Morning, Chris. The elective recovery plan was presented to the Commons rejected to the Commons as a plan to tackle this huge backlog. can it reverse the fact that 1 in 9 people are actually on a waiting list for hospital treatment in England?
Well, Trevor, let's start with the impact on patients. And I think it's really important. We talk a lot about the statistics here, but we just need to remember that there are far too many people who are waiting too long for treatment as a result of the disruption caused by COVID. And we just need to remember that this means that there are 6 million people who are in pain. At the worst end of things, we know that potentially these conditions can worsen and potentially turn into permanent problems. So every trust leader is completely aware of the need to get through these backlogs as quickly as they possibly can. We've worked very hard on this plan. It is stretching. It is very stretching. I mean, the Institute for Fiscal Studies this week described the headline ambition of getting to around 130% of the levels of activity in this area by 24-25 compared to what we were doing pre-COVID. So a 30% increase in levels of activity. They described that as certainly ambitious. So we've set ourselves a very stretching target, and we know that we're going to need to really do a number of different things to ensure that target is delivered. The bit that's the complexity here, Trevor, and I think a lot of the media coverage this week I found slightly frustrating, is the problem the NHS has got. If you look at the core waiting list issue about how big the waiting list is, we simply don't know how many extra patients who didn't come forward during COVID are going to come onto the waiting list. So we could be actually delivering that 130% headline target, which would be amazing, fantastic, and yet the waiting list would still be going up. So we just need to be careful about saying we're just going to judge NHS performance solely by how big the waiting list is, because we know it is likely to grow because all of those people who didn't come forward during COVID are going to come forward.
Well, I want to come to that in a second, but if we may, can we just deal with one, if you like, public service point here? One of the flagship aspects of this new plan is My Planned Care, which is described as an online service informing patients about waiting times and how to prepare for treatment. And the idea is that this will reduce cancellations. Can you just quickly explain how it actually is going to work?
Yeah, so what we're basically saying is that in order for patients to, and there's I think, quite an interesting concept here called wait well, they need to know 2 or 3 things. The first is they need to know when are they likely to get treated, and that will prevent, hopefully, large numbers of communications going backwards and forwards about exactly when the treatment will happen. Then the second bit would be we know that about 1/3 of cancellations are due to people who've got conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, where those conditions haven't perhaps been managed as well as they might be in the run-up to an operation. So we get to the operation day and then they effectively find that we have to cancel. So part of this is about providing and supporting appropriate information to enable people with those conditions to be in the state of health that we need them to be at the point when the operation happens. And I think all of us in the NHS know, Trevor, that we are behind not just the private sector, but other public services in terms of our use of digital. Part of that has been the lack of investment that we've been able to make. But this is a very good example of where we do need to ensure that we support our patients to actually use our services in a 21st century way. So this is, another way in which we can increase and improve our use of digital.
Well, OK, thank you for that. Look, there are a number of new targets and we still have to see how they're going to be operated. But one of the questions that I think this plan raises is that there are still things that the health services have to achieve before they get to these new targets. So, for example, in August last year, there was a record high number of patients urgently referred by their GPs, waiting for over 2 months for cancer treatment. We know that cancer patients often don't have 2 months to spare, and we're not even meeting the diagnosis targets yet. I mean, shouldn't we be thinking about getting that stuff done before we introduce some of these new things?
Yes, and that's absolutely what we're going to be doing. We've made a very clear commitment that we will prioritise the most urgent cases, of which, as you quite correctly identify, the most urgent cancer cases are key. And that's why we've set ourselves a target that 75% of GP referrals for cancer diagnosis will actually be seen within 28 days, because we know that's a really, really important task. One of the issues we've got here, Trevor, is that if you're a trust leader and you've got a very large number of people who are waiting, saying, there is quite a sophisticated but incredibly important operation to do in terms of clinical prioritization. And when you talk to trust leaders, what they'll tell you is that they spend a huge amount of time working with frontline clinicians, working with computer systems patient records to really identify in what order we should be bringing patients in. And of course, we will focus on those who are, have the greatest clinical priority, those who are most in urgent need. But this is in the context of, and let's be really clear about this, nobody in the NHS would want to see a waiting list of this size. And what's happened is we've had two problems. The first is we've had insufficient capacity in the NHS after a decade of the longest and deepest financial squeeze in NHS history. So the waiting lists were already growing before we went into COVID. And then what we've had is this huge disruption over the COVID period. So these waiting lists are they're by far the biggest we've seen for a very, very long time.
We've spoken about this issue of capacity before, and to the layperson, that is a problem about numbers of staff. You're, I think, 93,000 people short overall, nearly 40,000 nurses short. What can possibly be done about that, other than perhaps some really determined and intentional recruitment from other countries?
Well, Trevor, you put your finger on it really, really well. And we're just literally in the process of finalising the health and care bill, where there was a whole bunch of us who were saying to the government, you have to have a proper long-term workforce plan. And if it takes 3 years to train a nurse and 13 years to train a consultant, you have a very significant lead time here. So how can you expect the NHS to have the right level of workforce that it needs if it's not got a proper workforce plan in place? And there's been an amendment that was debated in the Lords that was originally proposed by Jeremy Hunt in the Commons, which it's incredibly important that we pass. So the answer, Trevor, is that there is good news down the track in that we are now seeing very higher levels of people entering training. But if I'm really honest, we've got this very difficult period over the next 2 or 3 years where we know we won't have enough staff. And you're absolutely right. There will be a significant premium on recruiting people from overseas. But that's not a comfortable place to be. It also isn't particularly helpful for the nations from which we're taking those staff. So we've got to have a proper workforce plan. And if I'm honest, I'm incredibly frustrated about the fact that the government will not sign up to the idea of a proper long-term workforce plan, which is what we have in every other sector of our economy and what we have in every other national health system. I can't understand why the government won't sign up to what seems to me to be blindingly obvious.
Chris Hopson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Trevor.
Well, that is all we have time for from the main show today. One thing we can be certain about, there will be, at some point, sometime soon, a new top cop in Britain. What we don't know is whether Mr. Putin and his people will find themselves in Ukraine by this time next week, though from what we've heard today, it feels like he may already have won the game that he's playing. And of course, the biggest question, we still don't know. Who will be Prime Minister next Sunday? I'll be here to tell you then.